History remembers the French Revolution as a storm of ideals, liberty, equality, fraternity, shouted from the barricades and inked into declarations. It recalls the rise and fall of kings, the roar of the guillotine, and the fiery rhetoric of men like Robespierre and Danton. Yet behind the slogans and the spectacle stood countless women, marching, writing, organizing, and dying, whose stories remain buried beneath centuries of male-dominated narratives. They were not just witnesses to revolution but active architects of change, daring to demand justice in a world that refused to see them. This is their story, a powerful chronicle of rebellion, resilience, and resistance told from the other half of history. The French Revolution is widely remembered as a time of dramatic upheaval, political ideals, and bloody transformation. It produced legendary male figures like Robespierre, Danton, Marat, and Napoleon, names etched deeply into historical memory. But the revolution was not only a story of guillotines, philosophies, or men in powdered wigs debating in assembly halls. It was also, and quite powerfully, a woman's story. From the overcrowded bread markets of Paris to the gilded salons of Versailles, from the drafty prisons of the Conciergerie to the March on Versailles itself, women were not only present, they were pivotal. Yet the common historical narrative has too often reduced their contributions to footnotes or tragic curiosities. When we read most textbooks or watch popular depictions of the French Revolution, women rarely receive more than a passing mention. At best, Marie Antoinette is cast as a symbol of excess, and Charlotte Corday as a mad assassin. But this shallow portrayal does a grave disservice to the complexity, bravery, and intellectual agency of the countless women who were active in shaping and resisting the tide of history. They were not just victims or side characters, they were rebels, agitators, thinkers, mothers, murderers, and martyrs. Their actions helped ignite revolts, challenge ideologies, and at times, shame the revolutionaries themselves for their hypocrisy. One of the most powerful and recurring themes of the revolution was the demand for liberty and equality. Yet these values were applied inconsistently when it came to women. The rights of man were declared with boldness, but the rights of women were dismissed, ignored, or openly ridiculed. This discrepancy didn't go unnoticed. Brave voices like Olympe de Gouges rose to challenge it, penning the Declaration of the Rights of Woman and the Female Citizen in 1791, a scathing and eloquent reminder that freedom without inclusion is nothing more than a rearrangement of chains. But Olympe was not alone. She was part of a much broader, often invisible movement of women who risked their lives to protest, organize, write, and resist. Working-class women, such as the market sellers and fishwives, formed the beating heart of early revolutionary protests. They were among the first to physically confront the monarchy, marching to Versailles in October 1789 and dragging the royal family back to Paris, a moment that symbolically and literally turned the tide of the revolution. These women were not driven by ideology alone. They were driven by hunger, by rage, and by love for their children. Their actions were not abstract, they were survival. Then there were the women of the sans-culottes, fierce, militant, and often armed. They were present at executions, insurrections, and protests, demanding not only food and justice but the right to speak, to participate, and to be acknowledged. They helped organize the Société de Républicains Révolutionnaires, one of the most radical political clubs of the time. In the early years, women had a voice, a platform, and a visible presence. But as the revolution devoured itself and paranoia replaced principle, this voice was suppressed. In 1793, all women's clubs were banned. Many leading female figures were arrested, executed, or silenced. The same revolution that once allowed women to storm palaces now forbade them from gathering in public to discuss politics. Women of the aristocracy and the middle class played a different, but equally essential role. Salonières like Madame Roland created intellectual spaces for Girondin thinkers and moderate revolutionaries. They didn't just serve tea and gossip, they hosted ideological debates and political strategy sessions. Others, like Madame de Staël, fought battles with pen and influence, challenging Napoleon's authoritarianism and preserving Enlightenment thought amidst reactionary tides. These women, though born into privilege, risked exile, imprisonment, and execution to uphold ideas they believed in. Many of them lost their lives. Even the vilified figures of the revolution, such as Marie Antoinette, deserve a second look. Long caricatured as an out-of-touch spendthrift, the queen was subjected to an extraordinary level of gendered hatred and symbolic violence. She became a screen onto which the people projected their anger, less for what she did than for what she represented. Her trial and execution were as much about female transgression as they were about treason. Her downfall reveals how powerful and threatening female visibility was in a moment obsessed with order, control, and reason. In this documentary, we aim to center these women, famous and forgotten alike, not as footnotes to a masculine epic, but as protagonists in their own right. Their stories are full of contradiction, tragedy, fire, and hope. Some were proto-feminists, others were deeply conservative. Some used pens, others used knives. They were philosophers and street fighters, martyrs and manipulators. But above all, they were human beings, fully alive in one of the most explosive periods in human history. Our narrative will move across class boundaries, cityscapes, and ideological fronts. We will visit royal salons and slums, prisons and parlors, guillotines and printing presses. Through these diverse spaces, we'll explore not just what these women did, but how their actions challenged or reinforced the values of the revolution itself. We'll confront uncomfortable truths: the erasure of women from revolutionary memory, the betrayal of egalitarian ideals, and the tension between public virtue and private oppression. This is not just a retelling of the French Revolution from a different perspective. It is a reclamation. It is an effort to understand the revolution more truthfully by including the half of humanity that was most excluded from its promise. By hearing the voices of these women, in pamphlets, in petitions, in trial records, in letters, we move closer to a complete and honest history. Their stories matter not only because they are compelling, but because they resonate. In every movement for freedom, equality, and dignity since the 18th century, the echoes of their voices can be heard. In feminist protests, hunger strikes, prison diaries, and courtroom speeches, their legacy lives on. The revolution they fought for may not have granted them the rights they demanded, but it planted seeds of change that would bloom across centuries. History, if it is to be just, must remember them, not as ornaments of tragedy or symbols of fragility, but as resilient architects of change. The French Revolution was, in many ways, incomplete. Let us complete the story. Let us bring the women back into it. Before the first cobblestones were torn from Parisian streets and hurled in revolt, before the guillotine became the ultimate symbol of justice and terror, and long before slogans of liberty, equality, and fraternity echoed through the public squares of France, a quieter revolution was already brewing. In kitchens, in laundries, in salons, and in the hearts and minds of the women living under the weight of the Ancien regime. These women, bound by layers of social, legal, and economic constraints, were not passive figures awaiting rescue by revolutionary ideals. They were survivors, thinkers, laborers, and agitators, deeply enmeshed in the contradictions and miseries of pre-revolutionary life. Under the Ancien regime, French society was strictly hierarchical, divided into three rigid estates. The clergy and the nobility comprised the privileged classes, while the third estate, roughly 98% of the population, bore the burdens of taxation, military conscription, and economic precarity. Women existed within these estates, but always at a social and legal disadvantage to men, regardless of class. The laws of the time treated them as minors, legally tethered first to their fathers and then to their husbands. They could not vote, inherit property freely, or engage in most commercial activities without male oversight. Marriage was both a contract and a cage, and while noble women might have had access to wealth or education, even they were denied genuine autonomy. For the majority of French women, those in the working class, life was far more brutal, dictated by physical toil, financial instability, and the ever-looming threat of hunger or illness. Despite these oppressive conditions, women managed to carve out essential, though often invisible, roles in the daily functioning of society. Peasant women toiled in the fields alongside men, but also handled the domestic and emotional labor that sustained families. In cities, women worked as laundresses, domestic servants, seamstresses, and market sellers. These roles were poorly paid, insecure, and often physically punishing. Many lived on the edge of subsistence, their survival strategies ranging from forming communal networks to engaging in informal economies, selling baked goods, taking in washing, or caring for children. For some, sex work became a last, desperate resort. These working-class women were not just laborers. They were the economic backbone of communities, the ones who made life tolerable amid poverty and rising bread prices. This gendered poverty had profound implications. For instance, the price of bread, one of the central grievances leading up to the French Revolution, was not an abstract economic issue to a market woman in Paris. It was a matter of whether her children would eat or starve. Thus, it is no surprise that when revolution did come, it was often these women who were the first to act. Their political consciousness may not have been formed in formal education or philosophical salons, but it was sharpened by daily deprivation and injustice. The marketplace, the laundry tub, and the shared hearth became their political arenas long before the National Assembly was even conceived. At the same time, higher up the social ladder, a quieter intellectual storm was building. In the salons of Parisian elites, educated women were beginning to question their role in society and politics. These salons, often hosted by women, became incubators of Enlightenment ideas. Figures like Madame Geoffrin and Madame du Deffat gathered philosophers, writers, and thinkers to discuss liberty, progress, and human rights. These gatherings weren't mere diversions for the wealthy, they were ideological laboratories. While most male philosophers of the Enlightenment did not advocate for gender equality, and some actively argued against it, their ideas nonetheless gave women a language of resistance. One of the most influential and problematic thinkers of the period was Jean-Jacques Rousseau. In his works, Rousseau championed the notion of the natural roles of men and women, arguing that women were designed to be subordinate, emotionally delicate, and morally pure. He believed a woman's virtue lay in her domesticity, and her political role was to influence men from within the home, not to participate in public life. His ideal woman, embodied in the character of Sophie and Émile, was submissive and ornamental, a muse rather than an actor. But Rousseau's ideas did not go unchallenged. Across the English Channel, Mary Wollstonecraft emerged as one of the fiercest critics of this gendered ideology. In her 1792 treatise A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, Wollstonecraft dismantled Rousseau's arguments point by point, insisting that women were not inherently inferior, but were made so by lack of education and opportunity. She demanded rational education, legal equality, and economic independence for women, not as a favor to them, but as a right. While Wollstonecraft was British, her ideas quickly found resonance in revolutionary France, particularly among women intellectuals who felt betrayed by the limitations of Enlightenment thinking. The very ideals that underpinned the revolution, reason, liberty, citizenship, were being used to exclude them. This ideological tension created a fertile, if dangerous, space for early feminist thinking in France. It was not yet a movement, but it was a spark, a recognition that the oppression of women was not merely incidental but structural. Women like Olympe de Gouges would later turn this recognition into direct political action, but even before the revolution formally began, the groundwork was being laid by thinkers and hostesses, by contradictions between words and actions, and by the lived experiences of thousands of women across the country. Meanwhile, in rural villages and urban slums, the majority of women remained outside these elite circles of debate. Their lives were shaped by relentless physical labor and social vulnerability. Washerwomen, for example, worked long hours submerged in cold, dirty water, often suffering from illness and joint damage. Domestic servants endured grueling hours and were vulnerable to exploitation, especially sexual abuse. Market women rose before dawn, braving the weather and often dangerous streets to sell goods. These women had little voice in the public sphere, but their grievances were deeply political. They knew, better than most, the failures of the monarchy and the state to protect its people. Their suffering was compounded by the fact that their work was undervalued and often invisible. Men's labor, blacksmithing, farming, carpentry, was seen as the foundation of the economy, while women's labor was deemed supplementary or natural. This perception allowed society to exploit women's labor while denying them the rights that were beginning to be articulated for male citizens. The injustice was not just economic, it was existential. These women were essential and expendable all at once. Yet when the revolution came, it was these women who marched on Versailles, who filled the streets, who banged pots and pans in protest, and who demanded accountability not just from kings and aristocrats, but from the emerging revolutionary leaders themselves. The seeds of their discontent had been sown not in pamphlets or parliament, but in breadlines, in unpaid wages, in children buried too young, and in years of being treated as second-class beings in both public and private life. What makes the story of pre-revolutionary women so compelling is that it is not merely a backdrop to political upheaval. It is a story of simultaneous revolutions, economic, social, and ideological. It is a story of women awakening to the contradictions around them, that a society can praise virtue while denying justice, celebrate reason while reinforcing hierarchy, and proclaim equality while entrenching gender inequality. The revolution, when it finally arrived, did not create this awakening, it revealed it. Indeed, the revolution might never have happened at all, or not in the form it did, without the prior agitation, suffering, and quiet resistance of women. Their lives under the ancien regime laid bare the hypocrisy of a system that celebrated divine right and paternalism while failing its most vulnerable. Their experiences formed a silent but unbroken thread connecting the injustices of the past with the demands of the future. And when the storm finally broke, it was these women, washerwomen, noblewomen, market sellers, intellectuals, who would stand at the front lines. This is their foundation, their origin story in the revolution. Not born of theory alone, but of bread and blood. Few figures from the French Revolution evoke such intense, contradictory reactions as Marie Antoinette. Was she a frivolous foreign queen, deaf to the cries of a starving nation, or a misunderstood woman caught in the shifting tides of revolution and misogyny? The story of Marie Antoinette is not just about opulence, scandal, and downfall. It is about how gender, politics, and propaganda combined to create a symbol, one that would be wielded by revolutionaries and historians alike to define everything they believed was wrong with the old regime. Born in 1755 as an Archduchess of Austria, Marie Antoinette was married at the tender age of 14 to Louis Auguste, the future Louis XVI, in a political alliance meant to solidify peace between Austria and France. From the start, she was seen as an outsider. The French people viewed the marriage with suspicion. Austria had been an enemy not long before, and now a foreign princess was to be the Queen of France. This early mistrust only deepened over time. Her Austrian origin would later be weaponized by those who accused her of undermining France from within, labeling her L'Autrichienne, a cruel pun that played on both her nationality and derogatory views of her femininity. From the moment she arrived at the French court, Marie Antoinette was thrust into a world governed by strict protocol and public scrutiny. The Palace of Versailles operated as both royal residence and theater, where the king and queen were expected to be on display, symbols of divine monarchy. But Antoinette found herself stifled by court ritual and gossip. Her response, seeking solace in private gatherings, personal fashion, and secluded retreats like the Petit Trianon, only intensified public scorn. Instead of acting the part of the dutiful queen, she was seen as aloof, irresponsible, and obsessed with luxury. Perhaps no myth is more enduring than the apocryphal quote attributed to her. "Let them eat cake." In truth, there is no credible evidence she ever uttered these words, and the phrase predates her reign by decades. But the quote captured the revolutionary imagination because it seemed to confirm everything they believed about her: callousness, ignorance, and disdain for the poor. In reality, Marie Antoinette had shown concern for charity at various points in her life, donating to orphanages and hospitals. But such actions were overshadowed by the image created by revolutionary propaganda: a foreign queen, disconnected from her people, who embodied the excesses of the monarchy. That image was not created in a vacuum. It was carefully cultivated through pamphlets, libellous, satirical and pornographic literature, and caricatures that portrayed her as everything from a seductress to a traitor. These depictions were drenched in misogyny, attacking not just her politics but her body, her sexual habits, her morality, and her motherhood. In an age when women were denied political agency, Marie Antoinette was paradoxically blamed for wielding too much influence over the king. If Louis XVI was indecisive, she was the manipulator. If policy failed, she was the secret schemer. No male political figure of the ancien regime was subjected to such sexualized scrutiny. Her perceived power made her an easy scapegoat, even as she remained constrained by the roles assigned to queenship. Marie Antoinette's public image took further damage during a particularly infamous scandal: the diamond necklace affair. Although she played no direct role in the incident, the scandal became inextricably linked to her name. In 1785, a cardinal was duped into believing he was acting on the queen's behalf to purchase a lavish diamond necklace. When the fraud was uncovered, the public saw it as another example of royal extravagance, and the queen's reputation suffered enormously. The affair confirmed, in the eyes of many, that the queen was a corrupt and manipulative figure who used the state's resources for her own pleasure. Though innocent in the matter, Marie Antoinette paid the price for a public already eager to find confirmation of their worst fears. The queen's perceived extravagance was, in truth, only one part of a larger system of royal consumption and court ritual. Versailles was an institution built on displays of wealth and ceremony. Marie Antoinette did not invent its extravagance, but she became its most visible symbol at a moment of profound financial and social crisis. France was teetering under the weight of national debt, tax inequality, and hunger. To the revolutionaries, she was not just a person, but a metaphor for everything that had gone wrong. As the revolution intensified, the monarchy's hold on power weakened. The storming of the Bastille in 1789 marked the beginning of a tidal wave of events that would ultimately lead to the abolition of the monarchy. In October of that same year, thousands of women, many of them market sellers from the poorest quarters of Paris, marched to Versailles demanding bread and political reform. They broke into the palace, forced the royal family to return to Paris, and fundamentally shifted the balance of power. For Marie Antoinette, the move to the Tuileries Palace in Paris marked the beginning of captivity. Though not officially imprisoned at first, the queen lived under constant surveillance and mounting threats. Her efforts to influence policy were increasingly desperate. She sent letters abroad seeking military support, notably to her brother, the Holy Roman Emperor Leopold II, hoping for an intervention that would restore the monarchy. These actions further cemented her image as a traitor in the eyes of the revolutionaries. The failed escape attempt in 1791, known as the Flight to Varennes, sealed the royal family's fate. Disguised and attempting to flee the country, they were caught and returned to Paris in shame. The escape plan had been mostly orchestrated by royal advisors and supporters, but Marie Antoinette, as always, was blamed. The queen's final years were marked by fear, loss, and resignation. Louis XVI was executed in January 1793, and Marie Antoinette was transferred to the Conciergerie, a dark and dismal prison known as the antechamber to the guillotine. Her children were torn from her. Her young son was kept in isolation and subjected to abuse, while her daughter was eventually sent into exile. The queen, once surrounded by silks and courtiers, was now confined to a damp cell, watched at all hours, and denied even the privacy to grieve. Yet even in captivity, Marie Antoinette maintained a sense of dignity. In her final letter, written to her sister-in-law Madame Elizabeth the night before her execution, she did not dwell on vengeance or bitterness. Instead, she expressed concern for her children, forgiveness for her enemies, and trust in divine judgment. It was a strikingly human document, devoid of the artifice and hauteur that had so often been attributed to her. She signed the letter not as queen, but as a mother and a sister, a woman stripped of power, yet clinging to grace. On October 16, 1793, Marie Antoinette was executed by guillotine in the Place de la Révolution. Crowds gathered to watch the final act of what many considered poetic justice. She was 37 years old. Her death, like her life, was both spectacle and symbol. The monarchy had fallen, and with it, the woman who had come to represent its most reviled excesses. And yet, history's judgment of Marie Antoinette has evolved. In the 19th and 20th centuries, especially in romantic retellings, she was increasingly portrayed as a tragic figure, a misunderstood queen, a victim of politics and circumstance. Her story has inspired operas, novels, films, and historical biographies, each offering a different interpretation. Some have emphasized her role in propping up a broken regime, while others have highlighted the misogyny and xenophobia that shaped her downfall. Was Marie Antoinette a villainess or a victim? The answer may lie somewhere between the poles of caricature and canonization. She was certainly not a revolutionary, nor was she a commoner's queen. She indulged in luxury while the nation starved, yet she was no more extravagant than generations of royalty before her. Her failure was not simply one of personal excess. It was a failure to grasp the depth of change sweeping through France. But that failure was shared by almost the entire aristocracy and monarchy. Her singular treatment, her vilification in pamphlets, her sexualization in satire, her prominence in blame, was shaped by her gender, her nationality, and the symbolic power she had come to hold. In a society beginning to articulate ideals of equality and justice, Marie Antoinette's fall was as much about punishing an idea as it was about punishing a person. She had become a lightning rod for popular resentment, a canvas on which a suffering people painted their rage. But beneath the image was a woman, one who loved her children, feared death, hoped for mercy, and ultimately faced the guillotine alone. Her legacy remains unsettled. To some, she is the embodiment of a feminine monarchy that failed to reform and paid the ultimate price. To others, she is a scapegoat, crushed under the weight of revolutionary zeal and gendered hatred. Perhaps, in understanding Marie Antoinette, we understand something essential about the French Revolution itself. that it was not merely a battle of ideas, but of perceptions, fears, and the roles that women were forced to play in shaping and suffering history. In October 1789, France stood on the edge of transformation. The revolution was already in motion, but its energy had yet to coalesce into a force that could directly challenge royal authority. It was not the aristocrats or even the radical thinkers of the National Assembly who would deliver this early, decisive blow to the monarchy. It was the women of Paris. Hungry, determined, and fed up with broken promises and rising bread prices, they took their cause to the gates of power. What followed was a march, not just across physical distance, but into history, as women of the Third Estate, long ignored and marginalized, asserted their political presence in the most dramatic fashion, by confronting the King and Queen of France at Versailles. To understand the origins of this movement, one must look not to high politics or ideological debates, but to bakeries and market stalls. Bread, the staple of the French diet, had become increasingly scarce and prohibitively expensive by 1789. Poor harvests in the preceding years, coupled with an economy strained by war debts and poor regulation, led to soaring food prices. For the average Parisian family, particularly those in the Third Estate, which included workers, artisans, peasants, and the unemployed, securing daily sustenance became a struggle of survival. Women, who were typically responsible for buying food and managing the household, felt the burden most acutely. When bread became unaffordable, it wasn't an economic inconvenience, it was a threat to life. The cry for bread became a political demand. On October 5, 1789, thousands of Parisian women, many of them market women or poissards known for their blunt speech and formidable tempers, gathered at City Hall. Their demands were urgent and direct. Affordable bread and accountability from the royal family, particularly Queen Marie Antoinette, who had become the embodiment of royal indifference. The protest quickly evolved from a riotous crowd into a revolutionary force. Armed with makeshift weapons, kitchen knives, pikes, and muskets, the women began their march from Paris to Versailles, a distance of roughly 12 miles. Rain poured down on the muddy roads, but it did not deter them. Their resolve was fueled by hunger, rage, and an unshakable belief that only the king could remedy their suffering. As they moved forward, more joined, men, National Guardsmen, and onlookers who recognized the historic nature of what was unfolding. This was no ordinary protest. It was a mass mobilization of the disenfranchised, led by those whose voices had long been dismissed. The crowd, estimated to be between 6,000 and 10,000 strong, arrived at Versailles by evening. Wet, tired, and armed, they surged into the palace grounds and demanded an audience with the king. What made this moment unprecedented was not just the sheer number of women involved, but the directness of their action. They had not waited for representatives or leaders. They had taken the revolution into their own hands. Inside Versailles, the royal family was stunned. The idea that common women, especially working-class women, could pose a serious threat had never been seriously considered by the court. But that assumption was now shattered. The women demanded that the king address the food crisis, and that the royal family return to Paris with them. Some even forced their way into the palace, engaging in violent clashes with royal guards. 2 guards were killed. Blood was spilled in the halls of monarchy. The Queen, Marie Antoinette, famously stood on the balcony before the crowd, flanked by her children. Though many expected violence, silence fell over the mob. Some claimed they were moved by the sight of a mother protecting her children. Others say it was the rifles trained on them by National Guardsmen. Whatever the cause, the Queen was not harmed that day. By the morning of October 6th, the king had little choice. He agreed to accompany the marchers back to Paris. Thus began the humiliating royal procession, a long walk back with the monarch and his family escorted by the women who had demanded his accountability. They carried pikes topped with the heads of slain guards, sang revolutionary songs, and declared victory. The symbolism of this moment cannot be overstated. The King of France, once considered a divinely appointed ruler, was now effectively a prisoner of the people, brought to heel not by military might or intellectual debate, but by a spontaneous, grassroots movement led by women of the Third Estate. The significance of the Women's March to Versailles was profound and multifaceted. Politically, it marked a turning point in the revolution. The relocation of the royal family to Paris placed them under the watchful eye of the revolutionaries and signaled the end of royal inviolability. The National Assembly also moved to Paris shortly thereafter, placing the epicenter of French political life firmly within reach of the populace. More critically, the march challenged long-standing assumptions about gender and power. In a society that denied women the right to vote, to hold office, or to shape policy, they had demonstrated undeniable political agency. Without formal leadership or structure, they had organized, acted, and won a political concession of historic proportions. This was not the first time that women had engaged in protest, but it was perhaps the first time that their participation had such direct and visible results. What made the October March extraordinary was not just the outcome, but the means. The collective action of ordinary women, largely anonymous, driven not by ideology but necessity. Many were washerwomen, seamstresses, and domestic laborers, those who lived at the edge of poverty, balancing the burdens of motherhood, work, and political instability. They were not educated in Enlightenment philosophy or connected to salons, yet their instinct for justice was no less sharp. These women had no names in the history books, but they wielded real influence. Their actions forced the revolution to confront the realities of daily life for the poor and to consider the importance of women's voices in shaping national destiny. They laid the foundation for later demands for women's rights, including those voiced by Olympe de Gouges, who would pen the Declaration of the Rights of Woman and of the Female Citizen just months later. There was no single leader of the October March, no Joan of Arc or figurehead to claim the mantle. This lack of a singular heroine is perhaps one reason why the event has not always received the recognition it deserves. Yet that anonymity was itself a powerful statement. It underscored that political change does not always come from the top down. Sometimes it rises from the streets, led by those who are dismissed, unseen, and unheard, until they can no longer be ignored. The revolution would continue for years, marked by escalating violence, shifting factions, and the eventual rise of Napoleon. But the events of October 1789 remained a defining moment, not just for the monarchy but for women. It proved that they were not just victims or bystanders, but agents of change. It demonstrated that political engagement was not limited to the wealthy, the educated, or the male. These women did not wait for permission to act. They demanded change and achieved it, altering the course of history through sheer will and collective action. The legacy of the March on Versailles reverberates far beyond the revolution itself. It challenges narratives that portray women solely as passive participants in history or relegates them to the domestic sphere. It reminds us that the line between political and personal is often thin, especially in times of crisis. When bread became a political issue, women turned domestic desperation into revolutionary fire. They forced the state to reckon with their power, and in doing so, redefined what revolution could look like. In hindsight, the October March was more than a protest over food. It was a revolutionary assertion of human dignity. It was a declaration, shouted not in pamphlets or speeches, but with footsteps and stormed gates, that women's voices mattered. Though many of the participants faded into historical obscurity, their impact remains. Their march not only changed the course of the revolution, it changed the shape of political participation itself. They showed that power, when claimed by the masses, especially by those considered powerless, can reshape nations. The women of the Third Estate who marched on Versailles may not have called themselves revolutionaries, but history proves otherwise. They wielded their suffering as a weapon and their solidarity as a shield. They forced a king from his palace and brought a government to its knees, not with armies, but with the hunger and courage of mothers, workers, and citizens. In doing so, they etched their presence into the foundations of modern democracy. Born in 1748 in Montauban, a provincial town in southern France, Olympe de Gouges began life as Marie Gouges, the daughter of a butcher. Though she later claimed noble lineage, her early years were marked by modesty and a rigid social order that tightly circumscribed the lives of women. Deprived of a formal education and married off at a young age to a man she reportedly despised, she soon became a widow, an event she regarded not with grief, but relief. This loss gave her the freedom to move to Paris with her young son, where she would reinvent herself completely. She adopted the name Olympe de Gouges and embarked on a life of writing, political engagement, and radical dissent. Paris in the latter half of the 18th century was a place of dynamic intellectual ferment. The salons buzzed with Enlightenment ideas, pamphlets circulated challenging religious and royal authority, and the stage, both theatrical and political, offered a platform for voices yearning for reform. De Gouges initially found her footing in the theater, writing plays that touched on themes of slavery, class, and social injustice. Her most famous early work, Zamor-e Mirza, denounced colonial slavery and revealed a sensibility deeply attuned to the moral inconsistencies of her time. Though it faced censorship, it marked her as a dramatist unafraid to confront France's hypocrisies, particularly when human suffering and inequality were involved. Yet it was during the turbulent years of the French Revolution that Olympe de Gouges emerged as a truly revolutionary figure. As France cast off its monarchy and declared the rights of man in 1789, de Gouges saw clearly the glaring omission: the rights of women. While men debated liberty, equality, and fraternity, women remained legally and socially subordinate. De Gouges, however, believed that the revolution's promises should extend to all citizens, regardless of gender. She began to write political pamphlets with increasing urgency and clarity, building upon the energy of the revolution while simultaneously challenging its failures to embrace true equality. Her most incendiary and enduring contribution came in 1791 with the publication of Déclaration des droits de la femme et de la citoyenne, the Declaration of the Rights of Woman and the Female Citizen. Modeled directly on the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, it mimicked the structure and tone of that foundational revolutionary document, but systematically replaced man with woman. This was no mere rhetorical gesture. It was a demand for inclusion, a direct confrontation of the male-dominated vision of liberty, and a blueprint for gender equality. In her declaration, de Gouges stated plainly, "Woman is born free and remains equal to man in rights." She called for the right of women to own property, to be educated, to hold public office, and to participate fully in the political life of the nation. Her work highlighted the contradictions of a society that championed universal rights while continuing to subjugate half its population. The Declaration was a revolutionary document in every sense. It broke with centuries of tradition, questioned the legitimacy of laws made without female consent, and insisted that no true democracy could exclude women. But de Gouges did not stop at abstract rights. She pushed the boundaries further by advocating for divorce, the rights of children born outside of marriage, and even reproductive freedom. Her understanding of equality was comprehensive and modern. She recognized that liberation was not just a matter of voting or holding office. It was the ability to live without fear, coercion, or structural oppression. Her radicalism, however, earned her enemies on all sides. Conservatives saw her as immoral, a woman meddling where she should not. Revolutionaries, particularly those aligned with the Jacobin faction under Robespierre, viewed her as a destabilizing force. Though de Gouges had supported the revolution, she grew increasingly critical of its trajectory. She was especially horrified by the Reign of Terror and the abandonment of revolutionary ideals in favor of authoritarian control. She opposed the execution of King Louis XVI, not out of royalist sympathies, but because she believed in justice over vengeance. In a time when dissent was often equated with treason, such views made her vulnerable. In 1793, the political climate in France turned sharply hostile to moderates and dissenters. The guillotine became the regime's preferred tool of discipline, and free expression was increasingly viewed as sedition. De Gouges continued to write, issuing a poster entitled Les Trois Uns, in which she proposed a national referendum to decide between different forms of government: monarchy, federalism, or republicanism. Though meant as a democratic gesture, this act was interpreted as counter-revolutionary. She was arrested, imprisoned, and eventually charged with having composed works contrary to the spirit of the revolution. During her imprisonment, de Gouges continued to write, protesting her innocence and defending her right to speak as a woman. She declared that her only crime was believing that both sexes should be equal before the law. Her trial was swift and her defense ignored. On November 3, 1793, Olympe de Gouges was executed by guillotine, a martyr to the cause of gender equality. Her death was emblematic of a revolution that had begun with high ideals, but ended by devouring its own visionaries. In the immediate aftermath, her name faded from popular memory. She was dismissed by some historians as a fringe figure, eccentric or hysterical, and unworthy of serious consideration. But time has proven otherwise. Olympe de Gouges has emerged in modern history as a pioneering feminist, an icon of intellectual resistance, and a symbol of the dangers and necessities of speaking truth to power. Her Declaration of the Rights of Woman has been translated into dozens of languages and continues to be studied around the world as a foundational feminist text. Her legacy lives on not only in her writings, but in the philosophical and political movements she helped to inspire. De Gouges anticipated many of the demands of 19th and 20th century feminists, including suffrage, legal parity, and bodily autonomy. She was among the first to articulate that the personal is political, a notion that would become central to feminist theory centuries later. Her life is a case study in the intersection of gender, politics, and literature. She wielded her pen not for profit or fame, but as a weapon against injustice, believing that writing could, and should, reshape society. De Gouges also challenged prevailing ideas about women's intellectual capacity. In an age when female education was rare and the public sphere largely closed to women, she claimed her right to contribute not just as a mother or wife, but as a citizen, a thinker, and a visionary. Her life was an argument against the idea that women were naturally passive or less rational than men. She proved that given the opportunity, women could stand as equals in shaping the destiny of nations. Yet her legacy is not merely inspirational, it is also cautionary. De Gouges was punished for daring to speak, for refusing to conform, for imagining a world where gender was not destiny. Her execution reminds us of the risks faced by those who challenge dominant ideologies. In her final days, she reportedly said, "If a woman has the right to ascend the scaffold, she must also have the right to mount the tribune." It was a bitter indictment of a society that treated women's bodies as expendable, but their voices as dangerous. Today, streets, schools, and institutions in France and beyond bear her name. Her face has appeared on stamps, and her works are now studied in universities. Feminist scholars, playwrights, and artists have drawn on her life and writings to explore the connections between gender, power, and political expression. Yet her full integration into the revolutionary canon remains incomplete. Often overshadowed by male revolutionaries like Robespierre, Danton, or Marat, de Gouges stands as a necessary corrective to the gender imbalance in historical memory. Her life story also raises larger questions about the revolution itself. If liberty, equality, and fraternity were the guiding principles, why were women like de Gouges excluded, or worse, executed, for pursuing those ideals? Her example forces a reckoning with the blind spots and hypocrisies of revolutionary politics. She compels us to ask, whose revolution was it, and at what cost? In the end, Olympe de Gouges' contributions transcend her era. She represents not just a moment in history, but a recurring pattern in the struggle for equality. A courageous voice raised too soon, silenced too quickly, and recognized too late. Her belief in the power of the written word remains vital today. In a world still grappling with gender inequality, censorship, and political repression, her writings feel eerily current. She invites us not only to remember her, but to emulate her courage, her clarity, and her uncompromising demand for justice. She was, above all, a woman who refused to be silent, a dramatist turned revolutionary, a thinker who defied her time, and a martyr who wrote her way into the pages of history, not as a victim, but as a visionary. Her pen, as sharp as any blade, carved a path for future generations to follow. Born in 1768 into a minor aristocratic family in Normandy, Charlotte Corday grew up during a time of rapid transformation and social upheaval in France. She was educated in a convent, where she immersed herself in classical literature and Enlightenment philosophy, developing a sharp intellect and a calm but determined nature. Corday was deeply influenced by the writings of Plutarch and Rousseau, absorbing ideals of Stoicism, civic virtue, and the moral responsibility of the individual. These values would shape her outlook during the tumultuous years of the French Revolution. Though far from the epicenter of Paris, Corday observed the chaos consuming her country with growing alarm, particularly the turn toward violence and extremism embodied by the Jacobin leadership. The revolution had begun with dreams of liberty and equality, but by 1793, France was drowning in blood. The monarchy had fallen, civil war raged in the provinces, and the guillotine operated daily in Paris. The Reign of Terror, under the influence of radical Jacobins like Robespierre and Marat, unleashed a wave of purges and executions. Among the loudest voices in this period was Jean-Paul Marat, a former doctor turned journalist who used his newspaper L'Ami du Peuple, the friend of the people, to denounce counter-revolutionaries and incite violence. Marat's fiery rhetoric was seen by many as a driving force behind the September massacres and the deepening factionalism within the revolution. To Corday, he was the very embodiment of the revolution's betrayal of its founding ideals. Corday was sympathetic to the more moderate Girondins, a group of revolutionaries who had initially supported the overthrow of the monarchy but opposed the violent turn the revolution had taken. As the Jacobins grew more powerful, the Girondins were labeled enemies of the state. In June 1793, the Jacobins ordered the arrest of the leading Girondins, effectively purging them from the National Convention. Corday, who had been staying in Caen, a city where many exiled Girondins had gathered, became convinced that drastic action was needed to halt the spiral of violence. It was here that she conceived the idea of assassinating Marat. In Corday's mind, Marat was not just a man, he was a symbol of tyranny cloaked in revolutionary zeal. She believed that by killing him, she could save the Republic from further bloodshed. Her rationale echoed the Stoic virtue she so admired in Roman history: the sacrifice of one to preserve the many. "I killed one man to save 100,000, she would later declare, quoting from Corneille's play Horace, which dramatized similar moral dilemmas. To Corday, this was not murder but a political act, a duty born from her love for France and her desire to restore its moral compass. Corday traveled to Paris in July 1793, staying at a modest inn while she gathered information about Marat's whereabouts. She purchased a kitchen knife with a wooden handle, and after several failed attempts to reach him, she finally gained access to his home by claiming she had information about a planned Girondin uprising. Marat, who suffered from a debilitating skin condition that confined him to a medicinal bath for much of the day, received her while soaking in his bathtub. Their exchange was brief. As Marat scribbled down the names she provided, Corday plunged the knife into his chest, piercing his heart. He died almost instantly. The assassination sent shockwaves through Paris. Marat, seen by many Jacobins as a martyr of the revolution, was transformed overnight into a symbol of sacrifice. His bloodied death scene was immortalized by the painter Jacques-Louis David in a haunting, almost saintly depiction that drew clear parallels to Christian martyrdom. Corday, for her part, made no attempt to escape. She waited calmly for the guards to arrive and confessed her actions without remorse. She did not deny the crime. Instead, she justified it with the clarity and composure that would define her trial and execution. At her trial before the Revolutionary Tribunal, Corday presented herself not as a criminal, but as a patriot. Her defense was built around her belief that Marat's death would restore peace and virtue to the revolution. She argued that Marat had corrupted the ideals of liberty and that his removal was a moral necessity. The prosecution portrayed her as a cold-blooded assassin and accused her of acting on behalf of royalists, though Corday insisted she acted alone and from her own conscience. The public was divided. Some saw her as a monstrous killer, others admired her courage and viewed her as a tragic heroine. Corday was sentenced to death by guillotine. On July 17, 1793, just 4 days after Marat's assassination, she was executed in the Place de la Révolution. She faced her death with remarkable poise. Dressed in a simple white gown, her demeanor was serene and composed. As she approached the scaffold, she reportedly said, "I have killed one man to save 100,000. Her final words, if not apocryphal, capture the paradox that defined her life and legacy. She had committed an act of violence in the name of peace. Corday's execution was followed by a macabre footnote. After her beheading, the executioner's assistant reportedly slapped her severed face, provoking outrage even among her enemies. The incident sparked discussions about dignity, womanhood, and the nature of revolutionary justice. Corday had committed a political act, but she was still judged through the lens of gender. To some, her calm resolve and moral conviction represented the ideal of feminine virtue. To others, her act was a terrifying betrayal of womanly decorum. The fact that a young woman, unaffiliated with any major political faction, could alter the course of history so dramatically unsettled many. In the years following her death, Corday's image was manipulated by various factions to serve competing narratives. To royalists and conservatives, she was a virtuous martyr, a modern-day Judith who struck down a tyrant. To some revolutionaries, she was a cautionary tale about counter-revolutionary treachery. Feminists and philosophers would later reclaim her as a symbol of moral agency and female empowerment. What is clear is that Corday defied the expectations of her time. In an age when women were expected to be passive observers of history, she chose to intervene. Her life and death continue to provoke debate. Was she a patriot or a murderer? An idealist or a fanatic? These questions reveal the complex legacy of revolutionary violence and the moral ambiguities that accompany political assassination. Corday herself rejected easy categorization. She did not act out of hatred or personal gain. Her writings and trial testimony reveal a woman deeply committed to reason, justice, and the hope of restoring balance to a world gone mad. Her assassination of Marat was not driven by vengeance, but by a calculated belief in moral necessity. Yet history has a way of simplifying the complex. In popular memory, Corday is often reduced to a single act, the woman who killed Marat. But her story is richer and more nuanced. She represents the potential of the individual to act decisively in moments of crisis, and she challenges assumptions about gender and political agency. In the masculine world of revolutionary politics, Corday carved out a place through sheer force of will and moral conviction. Her act, though condemned, could not be ignored. It forced the revolution to confront its contradictions. Could violence be stopped by violence? Could one death end the cycle of bloodshed? Marat's death did not, of course, end the terror. If anything, it intensified it. Robespierre used the assassination to galvanize the Jacobins and purge remaining opposition. The guillotine continued its work. Corday's hopes of restoring moderation were not realized, and the revolution plunged further into extremism before finally collapsing under its own weight. And yet, her legacy endured. In her quiet, resolute manner, she exposed the perils of political absolutism and the moral complexity of revolutionary action. Today, Charlotte Corday occupies a unique place in history, not as a footnote, but as a figure who challenges easy moral judgments. She reminds us that revolutions are not only fought on the battlefield or debated in the assembly, but also shaped by the convictions of individuals willing to risk everything for their beliefs. She reminds us, too, that history's most enduring questions often have no easy answers. Was she right to kill? Did her act accomplish anything? What does it mean to sacrifice a life in the name of virtue? In life and in death, Charlotte Corday stood at the intersection of morality and politics, idealism and reality, femininity and power. Her story remains a powerful meditation on the costs of conscience, the burden of choice, and the enduring human desire to make a difference, even if it means picking up a blade in the hope of saving a nation. In the heart of revolutionary France, as barricades rose and the monarchy crumbled, a new force surged onto the streets. Women of the working class, fierce and resolute, stepping beyond the domestic sphere to claim their place in shaping the destiny of a nation. These women, often referred to as part of the sans-culottes, a term originally describing the radical commoners who rejected aristocratic fashion and privilege, did not merely spectate the revolution. They lived it, fueled it, and in many cases bled for it. Their actions, often under-recognized by traditional narratives, brought urgency and fire to the revolutionary fervor sweeping the country. But while their energy helped drive the revolution forward, their bold defiance of social norms also led to their eventual marginalization. In the earliest years of the revolution, women were highly visible in mass mobilizations, most famously in the Women's March on Versailles in October 1789. That historic event, led by thousands of women from Paris demanding bread and justice from the king, marked a turning point not just in the revolution, but in the visibility of female political action. Yet, the momentum did not stop there. In Paris and other urban centers, women formed their own associations, participated in political debates, and more importantly, helped enforce revolutionary justice on the streets. The notion of the revolutionary woman was not confined to figures like Olympe de Gouges or Charlotte Corday. It also included butchers' wives, seamstresses, laundresses, and market women who carried pikes, wore tricolor cockades, and challenged soldiers and politicians alike. By 1793, female militants were an increasingly organized presence. Chief among these groups was the Société de Républicaines Révolutionnaires, Society of Revolutionary Republican Women, founded by Claire Lacombe and Pauline Lyon. This organization offered women a formal space for political discussion, mobilization, and confrontation. Members of the society aligned themselves with the radical Jacobin ideology and participated directly in the surveillance and denunciation of suspected counter-revolutionaries. In their red bonnets and militant garb, they patrolled marketplaces, policed hoarders, and even clashed with more moderate revolutionaries who opposed their inclusion. Their presence made it clear that women were not simply reacting to the revolution. They were actively shaping it, demanding not only bread but also political justice and representation. These women disrupted the comfortable gender binaries of their time. The revolution had promised liberté, égalité, fraternité, but fraternity rarely extended to include women as equals in the political arena. While middle and upper-class women like de Gouges pushed for legal and rhetorical recognition of women's rights, sans-culotte women were waging a more visceral battle. One fought through direct action in marketplaces, on street corners, and during public executions. They stood alongside their male counterparts during riots and protests, shouldering muskets and participating in neighborhood surveillance committees. Female sans-culottes became a formidable force in political purges and demonstrations. Their commitment to the revolution was uncompromising. They supported price controls on bread and goods, demanded immediate action against perceived enemies of the people, and backed the Jacobin push for purifying the Republic. They often led or joined mobs that executed suspected hoarders, aristocrats, and clergy. Their involvement in these brutal purges complicates traditional portrayals of women as passive victims or moral guardians. These women were not simply reacting to hunger or injustice. They were active agents of revolutionary violence. However, this very visibility and militancy sparked discomfort among many male revolutionaries. As the revolution progressed and radicalism intensified, the government grew uneasy with women who spoke too loudly, acted too decisively, or carried weapons with too much confidence. Gender roles, even within the most radical revolutionary circles, remained deeply entrenched. Women might have the right to protest hunger or poor conditions, but they were not supposed to be arbiters of politics or revolution. By mid-1793, cracks began to form between revolutionary rhetoric and revolutionary reality. Although the Jacobins had initially welcomed militant female support against the Girondins, their tone shifted once that political faction had been defeated. The female sans-culottes, so useful in intimidating moderates, were now seen as unruly and dangerous. A turning point came when the Society of Revolutionary Republican Women began to clash with other, less radical women's groups and with male authorities. The National Convention, weary of unchecked activism, took steps to suppress their activities. In October 1793, the government banned all women's political clubs and societies. The decision was swift and unequivocal. The justification centered on the claim that women's involvement in politics caused disorder and division, and that women's proper place was in the home, not the street or assembly hall. The Society of Revolutionary Republican Women was dissolved, its members disbanded under threat of arrest. The ban was a sobering reminder of how fragile revolutionary inclusion could be, and how quickly revolutionary ideals could be sacrificed when they challenged the social order too fundamentally. The suppression of women's political activism was not only a betrayal of the revolution's democratic ideals, but also a calculated move to reassert patriarchal control. After 1793, women were increasingly pushed back into traditional roles, their contributions erased or dismissed. Many who had once marched for bread and justice found themselves silenced, excluded from the public sphere, or even accused of counter-revolutionary sympathies if they protested too loudly. The same revolution that had drawn them into its fire now cast them out, reasserting the very gender boundaries it had briefly seemed to dissolve. Yet the legacy of the sans-culotte women endures. Their story complicates simple narratives of the French Revolution as a male-dominated political drama. It reveals how ordinary women, driven by necessity, conviction, and political awareness, reshaped their roles in society and dared to defy centuries of exclusion. Though they were ultimately silenced by the very regime they helped empower, their actions carved out a space, however temporary, for women's political expression. They did not speak from ivory towers or parliamentary halls, but from markets and alleyways, where the revolution was lived and felt most viscerally. Moreover, their exclusion was not a quiet retreat, but a forceful erasure. The ban on women's clubs in 1793 was accompanied by a broader cultural campaign to reaffirm traditional gender roles. Revolutionary propaganda began to emphasize the image of the female citizen as a supportive wife and nurturing mother, not a militant agitator. The figure of the Republic, Marie Anne, was idealized as a symbol of liberty, but a silent one, stripped of political agency. This transformation signaled a decisive end to the revolutionary moment of gender flux. In many ways, the fate of the sans-culotte women reflects the broader trajectory of the revolution, from radical possibility to conservative retrenchment. They embodied the democratic potential of the early revolutionary years, when ordinary people seized history in their hands. But when the revolution turned inwards and prioritized stability over participation, these same voices became inconvenient, even dangerous. In the new republic, there was room for female virtue, but not female power. And yet, the seeds they planted did not die. Future generations of feminists and activists would look back on the revolutionary women of 1789 to 1793 with admiration and sorrow. They saw in the sans-culottes women a model of courage, agency, and collective action. A reminder that political rights are never given freely but must be fought for, even in the most hostile conditions. Their experience underscored a sobering truth: that revolutionary change is often incomplete, and that those most responsible for its success may also be its first casualties. Their story is not just a footnote in the history of the French Revolution. It is a chapter of resistance and resilience. These women, who carried banners, armed themselves with pikes, and refused to be silent, forced France to confront uncomfortable questions about citizenship, participation, and equality. Their actions disrupted centuries-old assumptions about gender and power, even if only briefly. Though they were excluded from the official record, their legacy persists in the very spirit of revolutionary dissent. The women of the sans-culottes remind us that revolutions are not just made by speeches in assemblies or decrees from high offices. They are forged in the determination of ordinary people, on streets where hunger meets hope, where justice is shouted rather than debated. These women may have been pushed aside, but they were never truly silenced. Their defiance echoes still, in every movement that demands not just liberty in name, but in deed. Madame Roland, born Marie-Jeanne Flippon in 1754, emerged from modest origins in Paris to become one of the most intellectually vibrant and tragically emblematic figures of the French Revolution. She was neither a warrior on the street nor a legislator in the National Assembly, yet her influence on revolutionary politics, especially through the Girondin faction, was profound. Madame Roland's life intersected with some of the most volatile and transformative moments in French history, and her end became symbolic of the Revolution's descent from hopeful idealism to ruthless violence. From an early age, Marie-Jeanne exhibited a sharp intellect and a thirst for knowledge unusual for girls of her time. She was deeply influenced by the classical education she received under her father, an engraver, and supplemented this with avid reading of Enlightenment thinkers. Rousseau, in particular, left a deep imprint on her philosophical leanings. His writings on nature, virtue, and republicanism shaped her political ideas and, later, her revolutionary convictions. Although barred from formal academic institutions due to her gender, she educated herself in philosophy, history, and politics with the intensity of someone preparing for a public life she could not yet foresee. In 1780, she married Jean-Marie Roland, a provincial bureaucrat and economist whose intellect matched her own. Their partnership was more than romantic, it was intellectual and political. Together, they were immersed in the economic debates of the time, particularly those surrounding liberalism, fiscal reform, and the Enlightenment vision of rational governance. When the French Revolution erupted in 1789, the Rolands relocated to Paris, where Marie-Jeanne quickly transformed their home into a political salon that attracted many of the Revolution's key figures. Madame Roland's salon became a crucial space for the Girondins, a moderate Republican faction that championed constitutionalism, civil liberties, and economic liberalism. The Girondins found in her not just hospitality, but intellectual companionship and strategic insight. She wielded influence not through overt politicking, but through subtle persuasion, correspondence, and discourse. She wrote many of her husband's speeches and political essays, infusing them with her voice and vision. In this way, she became an unofficial advisor to a movement that sought to temper the revolution's more radical impulses. Her role as a salonière cannot be underestimated. In an age when women were excluded from the official mechanisms of power, salons offered a space for intellectual engagement and political networking. Madame Roland's was one of the most respected. She entertained and debated with prominent revolutionaries like Brisset, Vergniaud, and Buzet, shaping the ideological direction of the Girondins. While her political power was informal, it was far from insignificant. She became the muse and conscience of a movement, infusing it with both passion and reason. Yet, the revolution's course grew darker and more violent. As the Jacobins, under leaders like Robespierre and Marat, gained dominance, the Girondins' moderate stance became increasingly vulnerable. The escalating political crisis, economic distress, war, counter-revolutionary threats, created an atmosphere in which radical measures seemed justifiable, even necessary. Madame Roland watched with growing alarm as the revolution she had believed in turned toward extremism. Her writings from this period reflect her distress and conviction. She remained committed to the ideals of liberty and reason, but feared that the revolution was betraying those very principles in its pursuit of ideological purity and retribution. Her political essays criticized the rise of mob violence and the erosion of civil liberties. She denounced the demagoguery of the Jacobins and defended the rule of law and moral integrity, which she saw vanishing under the shadow of the guillotine. This stance made her a target. In 1793, amid a broader purge of the Girondins, Madame Roland was arrested. Her husband fled Paris and eventually committed suicide, unwilling to live in a France that had turned against its best hopes. Alone and imprisoned, Madame Roland remained defiant. During her incarceration, she continued to write, composing memoirs that reflected on the revolution, her life, and the moral collapse she had witnessed. These writings, composed with clarity and emotional force, would later become important documents for understanding both the intellectual spirit and the human cost of the revolution. Her trial was, by the standards of the time, perfunctory. The Revolutionary Tribunal, charged with ridding France of enemies of the people, found little use for nuance or defense. Her connections to the Girondins and her writings were enough to seal her fate. In the eyes of her accusers, she was more than a political thinker. She was a dangerous voice of reason in an age of passion and blood. On November 8, 1793, Madame Roland was led to the guillotine. As she approached her execution, she uttered words that would become etched in the history of the Revolution. "O Liberty, what crimes are committed in thy name?" It was a cry of both condemnation and mourning for the ideals she had cherished and condemnation of the terror that now wore liberty's mask. Her death, like her life, carried symbolic weight. She was not just a victim of political purges, but a martyr to the Revolution's unfulfilled promise. The execution of Madame Roland marked more than the loss of a single life. It symbolized the defeat of the moderate Republican ideal. Her death signaled the Revolution's transition into its most radical and destructive phase. The Girondins, with their cautious approach and emphasis on reason, were swept aside in favor of Jacobin absolutism. The terror would claim thousands more lives, but few would represent the tragedy of lost moderation and betrayed ideals as poignantly as Madame Roland. Her posthumous legacy would grow steadily in the years following the Revolution. In the 19th century, her memoirs were published and widely read, especially by those disillusioned with both monarchical tyranny and revolutionary excess. For liberals and early feminists alike, she became an emblem of intellectual womanhood and moral courage. Though she never explicitly campaigned for women's rights like Olympe de Gouges, her life challenged the strict boundaries imposed on female political expression. She demonstrated that women could shape public discourse not through force but through intellect, wit, and resolve. Historians have often debated the true extent of her political power. Was she simply the voice behind her husband's pen, or was she a political actor in her own right? Most agree that Madame Roland was far more than a passive supporter. Her role in shaping Girondin rhetoric and policy, her correspondence with key figures, and her own writings all attest to a political mind fully engaged with the revolutionary process. She understood politics not just as policy but as morality, and it was this moral vision that made her both powerful and dangerous to her enemies. Her life also reflects the precarious position of women in revolutionary politics. Unlike de Gouges, she did not directly challenge gender roles, but her very presence in political circles made her a transgressive figure. The fact that she was tried and executed like a political leader, not simply as someone's wife, underscores how seriously her influence was taken. Yet, at the same time, her execution reinforced the limits the revolution was willing to accept. Women could be symbols, muses, even martyrs, but not equals in shaping the new republic. Madame Roland's story resonates because it captures the contradictions at the heart of the French Revolution. She believed deeply in liberty, virtue, and the power of reason, ideals that had animated the Enlightenment and sparked the revolutionary movement. But those same ideals were consumed by the revolution's darker impulses: suspicion, fanaticism, and vengeance. Her life and death stand as testimony to both the possibilities and perils of political engagement. Her final words have echoed through generations because they encapsulate the betrayal felt by many who had once believed in the revolution's promise. "O Liberty, what crimes are committed in thy name?" is not just a lament, it is a warning. It speaks to the ease with which noble ideals can be twisted into justifications for cruelty and oppression. And it reminds us that revolutions, however noble in their aims, are fraught with danger, not just for their enemies but for their own children. Today, Madame Roland is remembered not only as the muse of the Girondins, but as a symbol of conscience in a time when conscience had become a liability. Her writings continue to be studied for their eloquence and insight, her life admired for its dignity and courage. She remains an enduring figure of tragic idealism, a woman whose voice, silenced by the guillotine, continues to speak across centuries. In remembering Madame Roland, we are reminded that the revolution was not only made by generals and orators, but also by those who opened their homes to debate, who wrote letters and essays, and who dared to believe that reason could triumph over chaos. Her life did not change the laws of France or command armies, but it did change minds, and perhaps more importantly, hearts. She reminds us that intellectual conviction, when paired with moral clarity, can be a form of power as formidable as any sword. The French Revolution did not simply topple a monarchy, it shattered an entire way of life. Nowhere was this more evident than in the fate of the aristocratic women who had once stood at the heart of French high society. These women, born into privilege and refinement, were suddenly cast into a world that viewed their very existence as a symbol of tyranny and inequality. As the revolution escalated, they faced a singular challenge: how to survive a society in which their identities, wealth, and traditions had become dangerous liabilities. Some fled, others adapted, and a few resisted to the end. Their stories are windows into the upheaval of an age, and the strategies of survival adopted in response to its storms. The French aristocracy had long been defined by its elegance, education, and distance from the hardships of ordinary life. Many noblewomen were patrons of the arts, hostesses of glittering salons, and wives of courtiers. They were raised to be graceful, clever, and charming, but rarely to be politically astute or independent in the public sphere. The revolution would demand of them an entirely different set of skills: cunning, resilience, and often brutal realism. As mobs stormed Versailles, the Bastille crumbled, and the monarchy began to disintegrate, noblewomen suddenly found themselves exposed, vulnerable, and, in the eyes of the revolutionaries, guilty by association. For some, flight was the only viable option. Emigration became a desperate but necessary choice for those who could escape early. Entire families crossed borders to seek asylum in Britain, Austria, or Germany, hoping the turmoil in France would pass quickly. Among them were noblewomen who abandoned their estates and riches in a matter of days. These journeys were often harrowing, marked by peril at every turn: false papers, betrayal, hunger, and fear of revolutionary patrols. Émigrés were viewed as traitors by the revolutionary authorities and were frequently punished in absentia, their lands seized, their titles revoked. One of the most famous aristocratic women to navigate this perilous new reality was Madame de Staël. Born in Louise Germaine Necker, she was the daughter of Jacques Necker, a prominent finance minister under Louis XVI. Though of Swiss origins, she was very much a figure of French intellectual aristocracy. Unlike many noble women, Madame de Staël did not flee at the first sign of upheaval. Instead, she immersed herself in the currents of change, turning her famed salon into a haven of political discourse and liberal ideals. A brilliant writer and conversationalist, she championed constitutional monarchy, Enlightenment principles, and individual liberty. Yet even her formidable intellect could not protect her from suspicion. Her opposition to Napoleon and her alignment with the moderate Girondins led to repeated exiles. Still, she used her pen to great effect, writing treatises that shaped European liberalism and asserting the importance of female intellect and political voice in a time of revolutionary silence. In stark contrast stood Madame du Barry, the last official mistress of Louis XV, and a figure of controversy even before the Revolution. Jeanne Biot, born into poverty, rose to the apex of Versailles through her beauty and cunning, a path that made her the object of both admiration and scorn. Unlike Madame de Staël, du Barry did not align herself with political causes or Enlightenment ideals. She attempted to navigate the revolution through appeasement and diplomacy. She pleaded with revolutionary authorities, offered up jewels and property, and tried to prove her loyalty to the new order. But her past was inescapable. She was arrested, tried, and guillotined in December 1793. Her fall from the highest luxury to a common criminal's death was one of the most dramatic symbols of the revolution's total rejection of the ancien regime. The guillotine itself became a chilling stage for the downfall of aristocratic women. Public executions were not just punishments, they were political theater. Crowds gathered to watch the formerly exalted fall from grace. Noble women were paraded through the streets, subjected to humiliating trials, and finally decapitated in front of jeering mobs. Their elegant manners and composure on the scaffold often served to highlight the grotesque inversion of the old social order. These women were not just punished for crimes, they were sacrificed to the ideals of equality and revolutionary justice. One of the most tragic elements of this period was the brutal precision with which status became a mark of guilt. The revolution, especially during the Reign of Terror, made little distinction between actual political crimes and mere association with privilege. A duchess who had funded charitable hospitals might be condemned for having attended court balls. A countess who had never spoken against reform could still be tried for being born noble. The distinction between action and identity collapsed, and aristocratic women bore the brunt of that collapse. Yet not all noble women went passively to their fates. Some resisted in subtle but significant ways. They hid priests who refused to swear loyalty to the civil constitution of the clergy. They passed messages to royalist factions, safeguarded family heirlooms, and protected émigré relatives. They also wrote letters, memoirs, and political treatises that offer invaluable perspectives on the revolution's impact on the upper classes. These writings often mingled personal grief with sharp political observation, capturing both the horror of persecution and the disorientation of a world turned upside down. There were also women who sought to adapt rather than flee or resist. They dressed in simpler clothing, spoke the revolutionary idiom, and rebranded themselves as citizens rather than countesses. Some even married revolutionaries or joined the new secular clubs, hoping that alignment with the new ideals would offer protection. But this strategy was fraught with danger. The revolution was a moving target. Yesterday's moderate could become today's enemy. Loyalty to the Republic did not guarantee safety if one had the wrong name or history. Many who tried to adapt were ultimately caught in the whirlwind of suspicion and denunciation. The paradox of this era is that while aristocratic women were persecuted as enemies of the people, they also became subjects of popular fascination. Their executions were not just political, they were consumed as spectacle. Newspapers printed lurid accounts of their trials and last words. Revolutionary artists depicted them in caricatures, often exaggerating their perceived vanity or corruption. In death, they were transformed into emblems of decadence, of nobility, of tragedy. Yet their legacy is not simply one of downfall. Many of these women, by their writings, courage, and endurance, challenged the narrative that the aristocracy was uniformly corrupt or indifferent. Their stories complicate the binary of revolutionary virtue versus aristocratic vice. They reveal the human cost of revolution, the loss not only of life but of culture, community, and identity. They also offer a unique perspective on resilience, how women raised in gilded salons faced prisons, betrayals, and death with grace and often quiet defiance. In the post-revolutionary years, particularly under the Consulate and the Empire, France began to reassess its relationship with the ancient regime. Some aristocratic families were restored to partial status, and noblewomen who had survived re-emerged in society with new roles. They hosted salons once again, though now infused with a more cautious political tone. Others turned inward, writing memoirs that recounted their losses and sought to preserve the memory of a world that had vanished. These memoirs, many published during the 19th century, became crucial documents for historians. They reveal the nuanced experiences of women whose lives were upended not by personal failure, but by the seismic shift of history. They also reflect on themes of injustice, courage, and identity. In them, we see women who refused to be merely victims, who observed, recorded, and often understood the revolution with a clarity that escaped many of their contemporaries. What ultimately unites the varied experiences of these aristocratic women is their confrontation with a society in revolt, not just against a king, but against an entire hierarchy of values and identities. Their fates illustrate how gender, class, and politics intersected violently in revolutionary France. Their survival strategies, whether flight, resistance, or adaptation, demonstrate the limits and possibilities available to women caught in historical upheaval. In examining their lives, we are reminded that revolutions are not only fought on battlefields or debated in assemblies. They are also lived in salons, prisons, and exile. They are experienced in silence, in fear, and in dignity. The aristocratic women of revolutionary France bore witness to a collapsing world, and in their witness, they left us a legacy that is both cautionary and inspiring. The legacy of women in the French Revolution is at once powerful and precarious. Their courage, resilience, and sacrifices helped to shape one of the most transformative political upheavals in modern history, and yet their stories have often been lost, diminished, or omitted altogether. While male revolutionaries like Robespierre, Danton, and Marat have occupied the pages of textbooks and historical analyses, the countless women who marched, fought, wrote, and died during the revolution remain, in many cases, obscure. Yet the revolutionary ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity, which so often failed to include women, also planted the seeds of modern feminist movements and continue to inspire gender equality campaigns around the world. The Enlightenment, which served as an ideological foundation for the revolution, emphasized reason, rights, and the pursuit of freedom. These principles were inherently universal in theory, but selectively applied in practice. Many revolutionary leaders spoke of universal rights, yet balked at extending them to women. In this contradiction, women found both frustration and fuel for resistance. They began to articulate claims to citizenship, education, suffrage, and economic autonomy not just as a moral imperative, but as a logical extension of the revolution's own rhetoric. One of the clearest manifestations of this early feminist consciousness can be found in the writings and actions of women, such as Olympe de Gouges and Madame Roland. De Gouges' Declaration of the Rights of Woman and the Female Citizen directly responded to the male-centric Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, highlighting the hypocrisy of excluding women from the promises of liberty and equality. These early efforts did not immediately bear fruit in the political arena, but they resonated deeply in later feminist thought. By the 19th century, women such as Flora Tristan in France and Elizabeth Cady Stanton in the United States drew from revolutionary ideals in building their own arguments for gender equality. The French Revolution, despite its contradictions, had created a space in which women's political agency, however brief or constrained, could be imagined. The influence extended beyond Europe. The Haitian Revolution and subsequent independence movements in Latin America were closely linked to revolutionary ideas emanating from France. Women across continents watched and learned. The struggles and failures of revolutionary women in France, particularly their exclusion from institutional power, became cautionary tales and rallying points for future feminists. The revolution's claim to universality gave feminists a moral weapon, even as they were denied legal or political power. Despite these profound contributions, many of the women involved in the French Revolution disappeared from history books. Part of this erasure stemmed from the nature of historiography itself. 19th and early 20th century historians often centered their narratives around wars, constitutions, and great male figures. The informal power wielded by women in salons, marketplaces, and political clubs was difficult to quantify and thus frequently ignored. Furthermore, when women like Charlotte Corday acted in dramatic and violent ways, they were often portrayed not as political agents, but as anomalies, madwomen, fanatics, or moral warnings. Another layer of erasure came from the political regimes that followed the revolution. Napoleon Bonaparte, for example, codified many of the patriarchal assumptions of the Ancien regime in the Napoleonic Code, which institutionalized female subordination in marriage, denied women equal education, and discouraged female participation in public life. The revolutionary window for female political expression had closed, and the dominant narrative of the revolution became male-centered. This was not merely an oversight. It was an active reimagining of the revolution in ways that rendered women's actions as irrelevant or disruptive. In modern times, feminist historians and scholars have begun to challenge these omissions. The 20th and 21st centuries have seen a concerted effort to rediscover and reframe the roles women played in the French Revolution. Works by historians like Joan Wallach Scott, Lynn Hunt, and Dominique Godineau have unearthed forgotten figures and highlighted the political activism of women who were long dismissed as marginal. Their scholarship illustrates how women were central to revolutionary culture, not only as supporters or martyrs, but as thinkers, leaders, and visionaries. This rediscovery has also found expression in cultural representation. Literature and film have played powerful roles in reviving the stories of revolutionary women. Hilary Mantel's A Place of Greater Safety, for instance, includes vivid portrayals of revolutionary women. Meanwhile, visual culture, documentaries, television adaptations, and historical dramas has helped bring figures like Marie Antoinette and Olympe de Gouges to a broader audience, often challenging older narratives that caricatured or simplified their roles. Museums, too, have begun to address the gendered gaps in historical memory. Temporary exhibits, curated collections, and public programming in institutions, such as the Musée Carnavalet in Paris, have acknowledged the complex roles women played during the Revolution. Digital archives and databases are also allowing scholars and students to access primary sources authored by or about revolutionary women. These tools have democratized history telling, making it harder for institutional biases to maintain dominance. The rediscovery of women's voices is not only an academic exercise, but a cultural and political act. The act of remembering becomes a form of resistance against centuries of exclusion. By reasserting these narratives, contemporary feminists link their struggle to a long lineage of women who dared to challenge systems of oppression. Whether through the defiance of market women in 1789 or the philosophical brilliance of Olympe de Gouges, these women offered blueprints for resistance that remain relevant. Yet, this resurgence also raises new questions. How should modern feminists interpret the complex, and at times contradictory, roles played by women in the Revolution? Some supported regicide, others were staunch monarchists. Some embraced violence, others sought reform through education and persuasion. Rather than seeking a singular feminist narrative, the legacy of revolutionary women invites a broader understanding of political agency. It reveals the diversity of motives and methods that women have employed in pursuit of justice. Moreover, the revolution underscores the fragility of gains made by marginalized groups. The brief period of female political activism during the early 1790s was followed by aggressive repression. Women's political clubs were banned in 1793, and by the time of Napoleon's reign, the public space once occupied by women had been firmly closed. This pendulum swing between empowerment and repression is a cautionary tale for activists today. Progress is not linear. It is contingent, contested, and often reversible. The narratives of revolutionary women also serve as mirrors, reflecting contemporary debates about gender, power, and visibility. They remind us that history is not only about what happened, but also about who tells the story. The resurgence of interest in these women is, therefore, not merely a return to the past, but a reorientation of how we see the present. In placing women back into the revolutionary narrative, we begin to see the French Revolution not only as a masculine struggle for democracy, but as a crucible in which the modern idea of women's rights began to take shape. Ultimately, the story of women in the French Revolution is a story of contradictions. They were celebrated and reviled, empowered and silenced, remembered and forgotten. Yet in the ebb and flow of their visibility, they left traces, sometimes faint, sometimes luminous, that continue to shape the world we inhabit today. Their courage to speak, to march, to write, and to fight in the face of overwhelming odds was not in vain. It reverberates in every contemporary struggle for gender justice, in every demand for equal pay, representation, and bodily autonomy. Their stories were buried but not erased, and in reclaiming them, we reclaim part of our shared human history. As we continue to reevaluate the French Revolution and its outcomes, it becomes increasingly clear that the inclusion of women's narratives is not simply a matter of justice or balance. It is essential to understanding the full scope of the revolution itself. Women were not bystanders. They were participants, agitators, thinkers, and victims. Their experiences reveal dimensions of the revolution that cannot be understood through male narratives alone. The revolution promised liberty, but for whom? It promised equality, but to what extent? It imagined fraternity, but did it include sisters? These are not just historical questions. They are enduring challenges that we continue to confront. In honoring the women of the French Revolution, we do more than correct the record. We enrich our understanding of one of history's most complex and compelling moments. Their resilience and rebellion remain a powerful testament to the unfinished project of human rights and dignity for all. The story of the French Revolution is often told through the clash of ideologies, the roar of the guillotine, and the rise and fall of political factions. Yet, embedded within this grand narrative is a quieter but equally seismic revolution: the struggle of women who dared to defy a world that excluded them. Their role in shaping, supporting, and even resisting the tides of change is a testament to the paradoxes of progress. The revolution promised liberty, equality, and fraternity, but for many women, these ideals rang hollow. The very movement that claimed to liberate the people often ignored half of them, leaving women to navigate the double-edged sword of progress and patriarchy. Women were both subjects and agents of the revolution. As subjects, they bore the brunt of food shortages, war, and social upheaval. As agents, they marched, wrote, debated, and in some cases died for the promise of a better world. Their involvement was not peripheral, it was central, though often invisible in mainstream retellings. From the market women who dragged the royal family back to Paris to the intellectual radicals like Olympe de Gouges, women infused the revolution with a moral urgency that extended beyond politics to touch on justice, equality, and basic human dignity. Yet their stories were largely written out of the history books. The revolution's male architects, from Robespierre to Danton, often saw women's activism as dangerous or distracting. Clubs were shut down, publications were banned, and voices were silenced. Even sympathetic thinkers who claimed to champion the rights of man rarely extended the same generosity to women. The idea of a politically active woman threatened the established gender order, revealing how deeply patriarchy remained rooted even in the soil of revolution. What is particularly striking is how quickly women's political contributions were forgotten once they were deemed inconvenient. The Thermidorian reaction and the rise of Napoleon buried their legacies under a wave of conservative rollback. The women who had risked everything, liberty, family, life itself, were now portrayed as hysterics, criminals, or irrelevant. The Declaration of the Rights of Woman and the Female Citizen, penned by Olympe de Gouges, was mocked or dismissed, even as the ideas it contained would echo into later feminist movements. The assassination of Marat by Charlotte Corday, intended as a plea for reason, was twisted into a cautionary tale about female ambition. Even Marie Antoinette, a symbol of royal excess, became in her final days a strangely human figure, scapegoated not just for her politics but for her gender. And yet, their voices were not entirely lost. The echoes of their struggles can be heard in the demands of 19th-century suffragists, in the manifestos of 20th-century feminists, and in the digital archives of today's historians working to reconstruct a more inclusive past. Each rediscovered letter, pamphlet, or eyewitness account helps restore these women to the stage of history. They are no longer ghosts lurking in the margins, but protagonists in their own right. The importance of rewriting history through inclusive lenses cannot be overstated. When we omit women from revolutionary narratives, we tell an incomplete story, one that reinforces the very inequalities those revolutions sought to destroy. By recovering the lives and contributions of these forgotten figures, we do more than honor their memory. We challenge the frameworks that once silenced them. We remind ourselves that history is not fixed. It is something we continuously reinterpret, rethink, and reclaim. This process of reclamation is not just academic. It has cultural and political resonance in the modern world. The struggles faced by revolutionary women in 18th-century France, over visibility, voice, autonomy, and recognition, mirror ongoing debates about gender, power, and equity. Their bravery provides a blueprint for resistance and a warning against complacency. Just as they insisted on a place at the table during one of history's most tumultuous periods, so too must we ensure that today's movements are inclusive, reflective, and aware of the lessons of the past. In reclaiming their stories, we confront the uncomfortable truths of revolutions, that they can liberate and oppress, inspire and betray, include and exclude. But in doing so, we also open the door to a richer, fuller understanding of how social change really happens. It does not begin or end in legislatures or battlefields alone. It begins in homes, in streets, in the minds and hearts of those too often ignored. It is carried forward not just by generals and philosophers, but by washerwomen, writers, and marchers. The women of the French Revolution remind us that even in the most patriarchal of eras, there were those who resisted, who questioned, and who fought for a different world.